Hey everyone, this is Scott from StartVideo.com, and in this video I'm going to be covering the Mashshare social share plugin. This is a free plugin found on the WordPress.org repository. All you need to do is search for Mashshare, and it's meant to style after the Mashable.com share buttons. This is a very common sharing plugin that I see, and there's a lot of things in here that I recommend you modify for a performance perspective and to just have a easier time managing. So when you install the plugin, you'll be taken to the settings window after you read through a bunch of pop-ups, and then you'll be met with this screen. So the first thing is that Mashshare doesn't have a share counter in the traditional sense. It has to rely on a third-party API from the sharecount.com API. You'll have to get an API key, which can be provided to you when you go to sharecount.com, but I actually don't recommend you use the share buttons, the share count API. And the reason for this is most of the time having the share counter displayed isn't beneficial to you. And the reason for this ultimately comes down to is unless you're faking the scores, and that's where the fake share count data comes from here, there's not really much research to suggest that showing a share count of 0 is going to make people want to share your post. But if users think the content is already popular, then they might be more likely to share. However, I don't like the extra overhead that it adds. If you're going to go ahead and use some kind of share count, I wouldn't recommend trying to aggregate that data in WordPress. You might be better off using a service like AddThis, which, as I've covered before, does have its own performance overhead. But if you have a very large website, the lack of API fetches and the data collection in the database will be better for you in the long term than the JavaScript hit that you're going to get using the AddThis service. So if you need to, you can go ahead and just go to the sharecount.com and get your API key. If you are using that, you have a caching method, and this is not a very good description, but basically the async cache refresh, it does it on a scheduled basis. So every new posts are updated every hour and every 4 hours for the older posts, and the really old posts get updated every 12 hours. That's how long that it goes to share count to retrieve the data and to save it in the database. That is probably the most performance option you can do. You could choose to refresh while loading, which rebuilds the expired cache. When the page is loaded after the cache expiration time, that is not going to be the best means because, and this is why preloading the cache when you're using a page caching plugin is also very important. If the user is first visiting this page, so they're visiting the page after the cache has been purged, they're going to have to wait for that data to be sent back to them. That's why it's almost always better to do these types of tasks in the background. Users don't have to wait on a delay, and it's just going to be inconvenient to them. As it mentions, if shares are not updating or the site is heavily cached, activate the refresh while loading. Async cache refresh is going to be your best option for most sites. The Facebook count, as it mentions here, you can choose to get shares or shares and comments. So if your post has 200 comments and only 5 shares, you have a really good engagement rate, but it'll aggregate the two together and say you have 205. Then you can do the accumulate HTTP shares. And what this basically means is when you have an HTTP website, or you did, and then you migrated to HTTPS, what ends up happening is the share counts used to get split. What this will do is it will just aggregate them together. So the HTTP version and the HTTPS version both are combined. So if you had 100 shares when your site used to be over HTTP, and 50 shares after, you'll have the 150 shares combined. You can then add a fake share count. This is basically, as it says, the number will be aggregated to all share counts, and then number of words of post title divided by 10. So it basically just adds a random number. You could put like 300 here, and it will have a default filler for your share count. This makes it look a lot better. Now, obviously, don't go crazy and start putting in like 999,999 because nobody's going to believe you have that much engagement. But putting in a realistic number can go a long way if you're trying to increase engagement rates or just increase the shares of your content in general. Personally though, I like this option to go ahead and disable share accounts. You just don't need to worry about it. And then as I mentioned here, you can choose to hide the share count. If you fill in any number here, the shares for a specific post are not shown until this number is reached. What this means is if your post only has 20 shares, but you put 400 in here, then the share count won't start counting or at least showing visibly to users until you've crossed that 400 share threshold. The execution order is really not something you need to do. As it mentions, if you use other content plugins, you can define the execution order. 0 would be the earliest, so 1,000 would be a fairly late executed plugin. Typically, if you have incompatibilities with this and maybe another plugin, increasing this number can resolve those because it allows the other plugin to fire beforehand. Most plugins and actions tend to use 10, 11, maybe 12 as their number. So this should already be in the clear for most plugins, so you should be fine. Then this is where you get the option to move the JavaScript to the footer. I highly recommend this. It will load all JS files into the footer of your website, so long as you're using the WP footer call, which every theme pretty much uses. You then have the option to enable JS and CSS everywhere. I recommend disabling this option. If you're using the PHP called for do shortcode of Mashshare, you have to enable this option. But for most sites, you probably don't need this and you shouldn't use it because it's not in your best interest to load assets to all users on all pages. I recently worked on a website where they were loading all these assets on all pages, and it's not a very lightweight plugin. It does add quite a bit of CSS, and by only loading it on the post pages, you can shave a good chunk of CSS off of your main file. You can then choose to disable the Twitter pop-up, which is, as it mentions, if you're check this box if the Twitter pop-up is opening twice. If you're using another Twitter service or another plugin that relies on the Twitter SDK, it can open up twice. So if you notice that's happening, this will basically just remove their extra call to the same SDK. You could choose to remove the data on uninstall. I recommend doing this. I'm of the mindset that if you're deleting a plugin, you're not going to want it back. So the data should be deleted. Now, if you don't have a proper backup scheme in place and you change your mind the next day and you're like, wow, I want to keep that, then you definitely don't want to delete that data. But for the most part, if you're properly maintaining your website, there's no reason to hold on to data from a plugin that you removed 3 months ago. And that's typically what this option is for. I would say if you're getting rid of the plugin for good and you've decided to move to a service like Add This, check this option right before deletion and the data can be removed. You can allow usage tracking, which just sends telemetry data to the developers to help support them and to gain valuable insights on the platform that their plugin is being used on. I typically enable this for most plugins just because it's helpful for them, and it's not like they're aggregating any nasty data that I don't want them to have. I don't do this for all developers. I only do it for the ones that I know and that I trust, and these guys have proven to be pretty trustworthy over the years. You have the option to hide buttons in widgets using the isMain query. So sometimes if you have a theme or a plugin and it's calling the list of posts, it may sometimes underneath your excerpt call the little share buttons. If that's happening, then choose this option to hide them. You can then choose to show the share options meta box for user roles. I actually disable this in most use cases because the box is really large and obnoxious. I'll go ahead and show you what this looks like. So I'm just going to add a new post real quick. And if you scroll down, you get this gigantic box that is just completely unnecessary. It's larger than Yoast SEO. It's longer than these theme settings, which are in depth and allow a bunch of different layouts for posts and a bunch of other stuff. This is just a monster. If you're using Yoast SEO, you don't even really need this section because your open graph tags will be output by Yoast SEO if you're using the proper settings. So I just disable the share buttons meta box, and when you refresh it, that data should no longer be showing, and you'll be a lot happier that your post edit screen is a lot nicer. So then we have to go to the networks option. When you're in here, you can choose the Facebook page URL and your Twitter username. I recommend filling out both of these if you are using this plugin. The reason you want this is because when you're using the username, it can be tweeted at you, which means you're getting a promotion not only for the post, but for your Twitter profile. And then for the Facebook page URL, this is just to show the main URL connected on the website. Now, the Twitter card data and the Open Graph data should remain off more or less. And I recommend just enabling these two options. In the Pro version, you do get additional share buttons. For the visual tab, this is where you get to style the buttons to your liking. I'm not going to play with these too much because it can be very time consuming, but more or less you can choose if the shares are rounded up, if they're animated. You can choose the button styling, how big or small you want them, if they're responsive, which they should be. And you can also set the subscribe URL, which is just your RSS feed, or if you're using FeedBurner, it's the FeedBurner URL that you'd want to place here. And then additional content is typically like some text, or maybe you want to have a short code. Maybe you're using Contact Form 7 as your email collection form that you're then sending back to MailChimp. This would be where you could put basically the subscribe box. You can place it here, and then you could choose to do it above, below, or in the subscribe content, which is the subscription window that'll appear if you have the open content box selected. The position is where you actually get to now start configuring where these things show up. By default, it is set to manual. I always typically recommend that you try to use the top just to see if it works. And you should only really use it for your posts. And if you have additional custom post types that you have registered, I don't typically recommend adding share buttons to your pages. I've never met anybody who wants to actively share the About Us page for a business, but they do share their blog posts. And then you could choose to exclude it from a post ID. You can list them out here and then use comma separator as the suggestion provides. So if you want to exclude it from 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth, you can do so here. You could choose to turn off or on for the home page. This should remain off. If you're using a static home page, it follows under the page option here. And if you have categories, you could choose to enable the checkbox on categories, and that should remain off. Really, the only time share button should be enabled underneath or above content is on your posts. That's where people are actually going to go to share. And then you have short URLs. If you have Bitly, you can add a Bitly access token here, and it will automatically create the short links through their service. Or you can use the WordPress short links service here. And this one very well will just use the ID. Oh, yes, as it mentions, it'll use the site and then question mark P equals, and then the ID code for your post. I don't recommend ever using this option. You'll just want to make sure that you're using the Bitly access if you have it. And Bitly does have a free API key that you can sign up for, so I recommend using that if you can, but don't use the WordPress short links. And if you're not going to use them at all, just make sure you have this disabled. And then the debug menu allows you to disable their cache, to purge the database cache if your share counts get out of sync. And this can happen, especially if your WordPress cron isn't properly firing. Go ahead and you can go here and purge the database cache. This will delete all share counts stored in the post meta objects table. It will take a long time to get that data back if you have share counts enabled, but it's a great means of diagnosing the issues that do come up. And I have seen this time to time, especially on websites that are hosted on not as good host, where the WordPress cron will get out of sync. And I've seen it happen where thousands and thousands of jobs line up into the WordPress cron and they just never get done because it'll crash every time it tries to run them because there's so many tasks that have now collected. It's not an ideal thing, but it happens all the time. Basically, use this as the last resort. If your share counts are getting out of sync and you've checked your WordPress cron and it's all working, you can purge it here. And then, as always, they have their add-on section. I'm not going to spend too much here because this is the paid section, but in here you have a ton of extra options for really making this plugin more useful than it is for the free version. This is not my preferred share plugin. Social Warfare is one that I tend to recommend, or the Genesis Simple Share. Of course, that one needs some more social networks, and I'm hoping they add them. But the reason I typically don't recommend this is it's a little hard to go through all these add-ons to make one really functional social share plugin. But the one add-on, if you're using this, I recommend is the Mash Networks. This basically just adds all the social networks that should probably be added in the first place, but they're not. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments below. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.